Mark, could you explain a little bit more about what this dispute is about? Because we've had a lot of hot air from Labour saying that this is 14 years of Tory austerity and this is the result. Um, is that accurate?
I don't think that's accurate at all. I mean, the default setting of the Labour government is that almost anything that goes wrong in any part of the country is blamed on 14 years of Conservative austerity. But we don't have rubbish piling up on the streets in most parts of the United Kingdom. So there's clearly something particular about Birmingham City Council. Let's hope we don't see it spread to other towns and cities. But there's something very specific about what's happened in Birmingham, isn't there? Otherwise, we would have tons of rubbish on every street in the United Kingdom. So what might that be? Well, obviously, people are focusing on the immediate issue, our picket lines stopping refuse trucks getting to the area, and there are some immediate issues that need to be dealt with. But I was keen to try and work out what I think the root cause is. And I think the real root cause is that Birmingham City Council has gone bankrupt. And why has it gone bankrupt? Well, there's not a single cause of that, but the biggest issue is a colossal equal pay demand handed down by the courts. Had they avoided that, they wouldn't be in the most robust financial health, that's true, but they probably would be in a position in which they could actually keep the streets clean. So I think you need to rewind 18 months or so to when Birmingham had to put in its Section 114 notice, I think it's called, effectively declaring itself bankrupt. Because once you've got a locally bankrupt council, don't be surprised if the bare and essential services start to run into trouble. That's exactly what's occurred.
And Birmingham isn't the only local council practically on its knees when it comes to funding. I mean, how have local councils, I'm thinking of, for example, Croydon in London, how have they got into such a mess?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And I worry somewhat that we've not yet really worked out where the bill falls if a local council gets into trouble. So you may have the economic problem of moral hazard here, that the consequences of going bankrupt for a local government and its local taxpayers, it's not quite the same as the consequence of a company going bankrupt, in which case it liquidates and everybody loses their jobs. We still managed to keep it afloat. But I think that local government has been broadly inefficient. It focuses on the wrong things, but I think they're also too restricted in what they can do. We are about the most centralised country in the Western world. I think it's about 95% of all tax and spend decisions are made in Westminster and Whitehall. So too often, local government authorities are basically carrying out prescribed diktats from central government rather than actually able to experiment with different ways of doing things. Now, you can do that wisely or unwisely. I think Birmingham City Council has been pretty poor in a whole range of areas. I mean, it's wasted a colossal amount of money on an IT system that doesn't work. I mean, we've heard that story so many times before in government. But really, I think the root cause is you've got to look at this liability of north of £700 million on an equal pay claim. If councils are going to be facing those sort of bills handed down by the court, we need to take a long, hard look and actually ask whether we want our government, democracy and judiciary to function in that way. Because hundreds of billions of pounds in equal pay compensation is frankly hundreds of millions of pounds that can't be spent on keeping the roads clean and other vital services. There's a straight trade-off there.
And for those watching who are unfamiliar with the equal pay demand, would you mind just giving a brief synopsis of what this court
Yeah.
ruling was?
Yeah, so what happens under the Equalities Act is you've got to ensure that you're not discriminating on the basis of sex, amongst other things, but this was about male and female work. And if it's shown that you are, those you've discriminated against are owed back pay. Now, you might think that at first blush, that sounds like a perfectly fair and normal thing to do. And if it were narrowly applied, I might even be sympathetic to that. For sake of argument, if you had a woman and a man doing exactly the same job, I don't know, as filing clerks, for example, and they filed exactly the same number of pieces of paper over exactly the same time span, you might assume that they should have very equal pay. But unfortunately, but perhaps unsurprisingly, the British courts have taken a much wider view of what equality should mean. So they have started to compare male-dominated sort of jobs. Refuse collection would be a good example. In the private sector, working in a warehouse is a good example. With female-dominated jobs, teaching assistant for sake of argument, or if you were to look at the private sector, being a checkout assistant, it's more likely to be female, and a warehouse man more likely to be a bloke. And they have then reached the conclusion that these jobs are sufficiently similar to warrant a kind of equal remuneration package and the same prospect of career progress and the like. And I think that is a huge overinterpretation of what must have been intended by the Equality Act. You are not comparing like with like, you are comparing apples with pears, and apples and pears are not priced at the same amount. So if we're going to have this extraordinarily wide interpretation about what equal pay means, we better get used to the fact that local authorities, as well as private businesses, are going to need hundreds of millions of pounds to meet these sort of bills. I'd probably do away with the Equality Act altogether, but at the very least, we need to narrow it down to very explicit, provable discrimination claims, not a general view that sort of the jobs that tend to be done by women are paid perhaps less than jobs tend to be done by men. That's not a like-for-like comparison. And if you make it a like-for-like comparison, it becomes colossally expensive for ratepayers and customers if you were looking at the private sector.
Well, I was actually just going to come on to the topic of the Equality Act. It seems like it's not, just this news dominating the headlines right now. It's other things like single-sex spaces, or most recently the Equality and Human Rights Commission announced that they're considering investigating Labour's welfare reforms to see if they are discriminating against the disabled. So would your solution be to scrap it entirely and perhaps replace it with some legislation that is much more concise and leaves less room for interpretation?
Yes, I mean, I think the problem we've got, not just in this area, but really across the piece in British politics now, is we've tried to take the politics out of politics. We've tried to pretend that there is some wholly neutral judicial legal ruling that can be reached about treating people fairly. And in fact, these are political decisions. Politicians are paid to make decisions that discriminate between different groups. And if you bring in a policy that might, for example, lead to disabled people not doing as well as able-bodied people, can that be litigated, or can that actually just be part and parcel of a government's economic plan that will then be judged at the ballot box? And we've, I think, stripped away from our elected politicians really the ability to exercise wide discretion, because anything that touches on potential discrimination or equality, you basically hit the third rail of British politics, and before you know it, a court tells you that you can't change welfare in this way, or you can't change remuneration in that way. So we've drawn it enormously more widely. I would scrap it altogether, but I think that I could just about see a case that if you were comparing, I don't know, a man and a woman doing exactly the same job to exactly the same level of skill, or a white person and an ethnic minority doing exactly the same job to exactly the same level of skill, then you might be able to raise a complaint if the remuneration was different. But this has now expanded beyond all belief that you can't really do anything. You can't change any policy that might be interpreted as having disproportionate effects on Group A as opposed to Group B. Well, that gives the margin for governments to act as an incredibly narrow one, and I think one that undermines democracy and is seeing us slowly but surely transferring what would have once been considered unambiguously political decisions into becoming judicial decisions. And the Equality Act is one of the key cornerstones, really, of legislation behind that. It's not the only one. I'd make a similar claim about the Human Rights Act, but it's a particularly expensive one. So let's get back to these decisions being political and decided by politicians and judging them at the ballot box, rather than litigating every last detail and case because of the sort of legislation that we put in place. It's a madness.
And Mark, you've also, in your Telegraph piece, you said that Birmingham is a dump is quite a familiar refrain you've heard over the years. I mean, what happened to England's or Britain's once mighty second city?
Yeah, it's right. It's a great shame, and I'm quite fond of the place. I don't know it that well, but my parents met at university there, so I feel a certain sentimentality towards it. I've been back there quite a lot for conferences and meetings. The Conservative Party holds their annual conference there every other year. It's just like so many other of Britain's cities, becomes sort of down at heel. Nothing went specifically wrong. It just looks grubby and dirty. And I think that there's too many parts of Britain that haven't really found their place. I would give my usual refrain that we're trying to get the government to do too much and are not allowing the private sector to breathe enough. And if you want renovation and restoration in some of our great cities, if you want to restore them to the greatness they had, indeed go beyond that, I think you've got to find a way to allow the private sector to do an awful lot more, and frankly, Birmingham City Council and others to do an awful lot less. There seems to be a striking correlation between those parts of the UK that aren't doing so well and the size of the government and the proportion of state spending in those areas. I derive a lesson from that you want a rather light touch governmental spending and regulation regime. And if you get a light touch one, you tend to get prosperity following it. So let's get away from central planning and believing that cities should really be designed by mayors, councils and planning committees. And let's get back to it being designed by their own people in their own enterprising fashion. That's what made these cities great in the first place. No grand political central design, but the individual actions, dreams and aspirations of men and women up and down Britain. If we get back to that as a core principle, then I think these sort of cities and places reviving will swiftly follow.
And Mark, I just want to quiz you on something. Someone I spoke to previously who's an activist thought that this will basically give rise to more independent candidates, whether it's in local or general elections. I mean, what's your view on that? Do you think there's a bit more hope for places like Birmingham with more people who lose faith in parties and cast their vote for an independent, or is that just going to cause other problems?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I was looking, we've just seen the tallies for the total number of candidates from each party who will be running in May's local elections. Actually, Reform UK have managed to field more candidates than any other party. And I think there are about 500 candidates, so that's about in 1 in 3 seats, who are running under no party banner at all. And I would keep an eye on them. I think that there is now such a fall off in faith in the mainstream political parties and the political system in general that we could see all sorts of curious results. Obviously, Reform UK look to benefit from that quite substantially, if you believe the opinion polls at the moment. But I suspect it won't all just end up in the Reform box. Here's the problem, though. It's one thing to vote as a protest for someone who isn't connected to any established legacy political party. But quite how you form a sensible administration out of that is a rather greater challenge. If you elect, 10, 15, 20, 25 random independents onto the local council, are they in any way equipped to form an administration? So I fear, although I understand why people might vote this way, I fear it's more of a cri de coeur than it is a proper solution to the problems that we face in many of our towns and cities up and down the country.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you on Spectator TV.
Great to be with you.